See, being a veterinarian, Alexis leaves for work when it's still dark out, and most days she comes home when it's already dark again. And I kept thinking about that moment, pulling into the driveway at the end of a long day, exhausted and mentally drained, and having to walk up to a house that doesn't really greet you at all. It just exists. So I decided to fix it in the best way that I knew how to. But instead of starting with this big explanation or some kind of reveal, I just want to jump straight into it because this project didn't actually start with a plan or a design. It was just me trying to solve a problem that felt more emotional than it was visual. See, I wanted our house to feel welcoming, like it was saying, "You're home, you made it back, congratulations." So I decided to bring as much daylight back to our house as possible, even if it was midnight. One of the first real challenges with this project was figuring out how to get power where it needed to go without making the whole thing feel rushed or sloppy. If the lights were going to feel calming, the wiring had to disappear. And that meant running low voltage cable underneath the driveway instead of around it. Part of that was practical, and part of it was personal. See, Alexis absolutely hates messy wiring. It drives her crazy. Exposed cables, temporary solutions, things that look unfinished, they stick with her. And I get it. When your brain is already overloaded, little things don't stay little. So the plan was simple enough. I was going to attach PVC pipe and run high pressure water through it, and then push the pipe forward as the water cuts through the soil underneath the driveway. I'd seen this done before on YouTube, and it looked pretty straightforward. At first, it actually worked. The pipe slid forward, and the water flowed, and everything felt easy, and I remember thinking, alright, maybe this won't be a fight. And then the sand underneath the driveway started collapsing. The pipe stopped moving, the hole tightened up around it, and every time I pushed, it felt like the ground was pushing back even harder. No matter how much water I used, the resistance just kept growing. It turned into this frustrating stalemate where progress completely stopped. I stood there longer than I probably needed to, just staring at it, trying to convince myself that if I just kept going, it would eventually give. And that's usually my instinct, is just push harder, stay stubborn, and don't quit just yet. Eventually, I grabbed a sledgehammer and a dead blow hammer and started knocking the pipe forward one hit at a time. Each hit felt absolutely ridiculous. It was loud and messy and took way too much effort for something that no one would ever see once it's finished. And I remember thinking how easy it would be to just say, this is stupid, no one cares, just run the wire above the driveway. But that's kind of the point of why I'm doing this. Unless you spent a lot of time around the veterinarian world, it's hard to explain how much weight comes home with these people. Long days in the heat, animals that can't tell you what hurts, and owners who are emotional, stressed, and angry, and all the while they have to make decisions that matter all the time. There are nights where Alexis gets home and doesn't really say much at first, not because anything specific went wrong, just because there's nothing left. I've seen her sit in the car for a minute before coming inside. I've watched her scroll through her phone without really looking at it, and I've heard the stories that don't even sound dramatic anymore because they're just normal in that field. Veterinary medicine has one of the highest suicide rates of any profession, and that's not a statistic that I can ignore or joke about. That's real people, real lives, and people who care deeply and carry more than they should have to. So when I think about her pulling into the driveway at night, I don't think about lighting fixtures or wire paths. I'm thinking about how that moment emotionally feels. Whether it feels like one more thing to deal with or the first moment of relief that she's had all day. Your home should absorb your stress, not amplify it. And that is why I stood there swinging a sledgehammer at a piece of PVC under a driveway. Because this wasn't about being over-engineered. It wasn't about doing things the right way for the internet. It was about removing friction, about eliminating the little irritations before they ever had a chance to exist. If hiding a wire meant one less thing that felt unfinished and one less thing that caught her eye on a bad day, then it was worth the effort. And when the pipe finally broke through to the other side, it didn't just feel like a win, it felt like relief. After the first driveway, I felt confident, probably more confident than I should have been. The plan had worked once, so I expected it to work again. Same tools, same methods, same mindset, but it didn't. Almost immediately, I hit resistance. Roots everywhere, rocks underground, hard soil that the water couldn't cut through. No matter how much I adjusted, nothing moved. I tried different angles, different starting points, more pressure, less pressure. Every attempt ended the same way. Stuck. At first, I treated it like a puzzle, something I just hadn't solved yet. So I pushed harder, and that's usually where things start to go wrong for me, because there's a point in every project where effort stops being productive and starts just being stubborn. When you're no longer working towards a solution and instead you're just refusing to accept that the original plan might not be the right one anymore. Standing there, soaked and frustrated, I kept telling myself that if I just tried one more time, it would work. That quitting meant failure, and that doing it any other way meant I'd messed something up. And admitting that this wasn't going to work, at least not the way I wanted it to, felt almost impossible for me to do in this situation. See, perfectionism has always shown up in my life disguised as preparation. It looks like planning, like thinking things through, wanting to do things the right way, and for a long time I've convinced myself that was a good thing, that it meant I cared, or that it meant I had standards. But if I'm honest, a lot of it is just fear. I have this habit of replaying decisions in my head before I ever make them, running through every possible outcome, every mistake I could make, every way something might fall short of the version that I had imagined, and the longer I sit in that space, the harder it becomes to actually start. There are projects I've put off for months, sometimes years, not because I couldn't do them, but because I couldn't picture doing them perfectly. I'd tell myself I needed more time, better tools, a clearer plan, that I'd start once I felt more confident. But confidence doesn't really work like that. It doesn't show up fully formed, waiting for you to be ready. It usually just comes after you've already started and survived a couple mistakes. What perfectionism really does, at least for me, is raise the cost of failure so high that doing nothing starts to feel safer. Because if you never finish, you never have to confront the gap between what you imagined and what you actually built. And that mindset doesn't stay confined to just projects either. It leaks into work, into relationships, into the way that you talk to yourself when things don't go exactly as planned. It turns small imperfections into personal failures, even when no one else would ever notice them. Standing there by the driveway, I could feel all of that bubbling up in my brain, that familiar urge to just keep forcing the original plan so I wouldn't have to admit it wasn't working, just so I could tell myself I didn't settle. But settling isn't the same thing as accepting reality, it turns out. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is acknowledge that the perfect version you had in your head was never the point to begin with. At some point, you need to decide what matters more, the idea that you had in your head or the result you actually need. Instead of running the wire under the driveway, I ran it over. I tucked it carefully into an existing crack, hidden just enough that it didn't draw attention to itself, and it wasn't invisible. It wasn't the version I imagined when I first started, but it worked. And more importantly, it moved the project forward. That progress doesn't lose its value just because it's imperfect. Finishing something is better than endlessly chasing a version that never actually exists. That moment completely changed how I approached the rest of this project. I stopped asking, is this the perfect solution, and just started working. And honestly, the purpose was never perfection. The purpose was a home that feels welcoming at the end of a long day. With the front yard slowly coming together, I shifted focus to the backyard. And if the front felt dark before, the backyard was something else entirely. Once the sun went down, the space literally just vanished. When I first started thinking about putting lights in the backyard, I knew what I wanted it to feel like, but I didn't yet know what was holding it back. I just knew I was nervous. Hanging light bulbs sounds simple, but it's one of those things that can go sideways really fast, because there's a version of this that feels intentional and warm, and there's another version that feels like it came straight out of your weird uncle's trailer park, and that's when it clicked. The problem wasn't that I was adding lights, it was what the lights would be revealing. Because no matter how much light there was, the entire left side of the view of the backyard was blocked by this massive dead tree sitting right in the middle of everything. During the day, it was easy to ignore, it kind of just blended into the background, just another tree, but if I left the tree, the lights would never feel like they were set up for the space, they would feel like they were working around the space. And that's where the trailer park fear really came from. Not from the lights, but from the idea of layering something pretty on top of something unresolved. Once I saw that, the decision was easy. The tree wasn't a feature, it wasn't sentimental, it wasn't adding anything to the space, it was just there because it had always been there. And if I wanted the lights to work the way I intended, it had to go. Now, I've never felled a tree before. I'm not an expert, and I'm not pretending to be one. This was not a tutorial or a demonstration, and I do not necessarily recommend following anything you're about to see. It was just me trying my best. Now, once I realized it needed to go, there wasn't any excitement about it, just a lot of nervousness. A dead tree is not something that you experiment with, and it's not something that you treat casually, especially when you've never done this before. And I knew right away this wasn't something I wanted to do alone. Before I even started setting tools out, I called my sister and asked her to come over. Not to help cut, not to hold anything except the camera, mostly just to be there, just in case. I remember half joking when I asked her to come over, saying something like, if I get squished by a tree, somebody should probably know about it. But underneath that joke was the understanding that this was real. Things can go wrong. And pretending otherwise does not make you safer. I spent a lot of time just looking at the tree. The lean, the branches, the way it sat in the yard. I thought about where it needed to fall and what would happen if it didn't go where it needed to go. I cleared the area, moved anything that didn't belong, and gave myself space to work without rushing. Then I made the cut. And then it was over. The tree landed exactly where I aimed it. Clean, controlled, no surprises. And what I felt in that moment was not just excitement, it was a huge sigh of relief. Relief that no one got hurt, relief that it went the way that it needed to, and relief that the space was finally ready to get finished. After that came hours of work that wasn't nearly as dangerous, just very tiring. Cutting the trunk into sections, dragging branches, stacking everything in the back of the property, all of it set aside to dry out and eventually become bonfire fuel. Something that would actually be useful instead of standing dead in the middle of the yard. Now, the backyard felt ready, but I needed a break from it after all of that stress. So heading back to the front yard, it was time for final light assembly. Every single light needed to be disassembled and then reassembled properly before it could ever go in the ground. So I set up an indoor assembly table and started building all 22 lights, even though I really only needed about 15. By the time I got to this part of the project, most of the big physical decisions were already made. The wiring paths were figured out, the layout was more or less locked in, and the yard had started to take shape in my head. Now, there's something about repetitive work like this, the same motion over and over again, that gives your mind room to wander. You stop thinking about what your hands are doing and start thinking about everything else. And as I was sitting there assembling light after light, I found myself thinking about when I was a kid. I grew up riding through neighborhoods at night, usually in the backseat of a car, staring out the window, while the adults talked about the economy or their latest mortgage news. I remember being half asleep watching streetlights pass by and noticing certain houses more than others. Not necessarily the biggest houses, and not the newest ones even, just the ones that felt warm. They'd have lights tucked into the landscaping, soft light washing up onto the trees, the house glowing just enough to feel alive. Even without knowing why, those houses felt different, safer, like somebody actually cared about them. I didn't really have the words for it back then, but I think what I was really noticing was intention. Those homes felt thought out, like the people who lived there paid attention to how it felt to come home at night, and I remember thinking, even as a kid, that one day I wanted my house to feel like that. At the time, it felt like a distant idea, something for later, that you think about without really believing you'll ever get there, but sitting at that table building these lights, it hit me how strange it was that I was there now. Not imagining it, not wishing for it, actually doing it. And after everything was assembled, I carried the lights outside, and I started laying them out in the yard. Nothing was measured, nothing was staked in yet, I just placed them where they felt right. near trees that deserved to be highlighted, along edges that needed definition in spots where light would add depth instead of flattening everything out. I'm sure there's a science to things like this, but sometimes you need to literally just go with what feels right. With everything laid out, it was time to start sending electricity down the line. Once you start connecting wires, there's no more pretending. Either this works or it doesn't. And every decision you made earlier shows up right here. I started with waterproof wire nuts that I bought specifically for this job. They came pre-filled with silicone, which sounded perfect in theory. Clean, sealed, and ready to go. But as soon as I started working on the main trunk lines, it became very obvious they weren't gonna cut it. The wire bundles were way thicker than I expected, and forcing them together was not gonna work. That's one of those moments where you pause, and you gotta decide what kind of builder you're gonna be. You can either fight the parts and hope for the best, or you can slow down and adapt. So I adapted. I grabbed larger wire nuts and filled them myself with silicone. It wasn't exactly clean, but it solved the problem. The connections were solid, sealed, and sized properly for what I was actually working with. This entire project kind of lived in that gray area of not perfect, not store-bought solutions, but thoughtful ones, and doing the best that you can with what you have instead of forcing something just because it's supposed to be the right way. And once the connections were made, I started testing everything. One branch at a time, one run at a time. I didn't rush it because this was not the part to rush. This is where small mistakes would hide and show up later when I least wanted them to. Now that we got all the branches and the trunks hooked in together, it's probably a good idea to actually test and make sure that there's power getting all the way from the inverter all the way out to the far ends of where those cables are laid. So I'm gonna go ahead and attach the final end of our cable here into the inverter and then get the inverter plugged into the wall here so we can test and make sure that we have proper 12 volts or somewhere near that all the way out to the furthest ends, which are up to 200 feet away from the main part of my house here. All right, now that the inverter is hooked up, we're gonna go and check every single end of the wires that are exposed with this multimeter to make sure that we're getting somewhere between 12 and 14 volts at every end of this run. I walked the yard slowly with my multimeter in hand, checking voltage at the end of each branch. 13.12 volts, 13.14 volts. Everything was consistent, stable, and exactly where I wanted it to be. And there's something deeply satisfying about moments like that. It's the feeling that the system is healthy, that the effort that you put in is finally paying off, and that the thing you imagined is actually going to work. And as I moved from connection to connection, the yard started to feel different even before the lights were on. Everything was waiting. It felt like standing backstage before a performance. All of the work was done, everything was in position. Now I was just waiting for the moment when it comes alive. And standing there, I realized how much this part mirrored all of the other unseen work on the whole project. Alexis would never see the wire nuts carefully waterproofed and buried underground. She'd never think about the voltage readings or trunk lines, but she would feel the result. The calm, the warmth, the sense that this space was built by somebody who cared about it. And by the time I finished the last connection and cleaned up all the tools, the front yard was technically done. All the hard parts were finished, and everything was ready. Now, everything in me wanted to flip the switch and see it come to life. I'd spent hours laying out fixtures, burying wire, and testing connections, and making sure every detail was right. The reveal was right there, but I didn't do it. Instead, I walked back to the backyard to finish my last piece of the puzzle. This was the section I was most unsure about from the very beginning. Hanging lights sound simple, but there's a lot riding on how it feels once they're up. The height, the spacing, the wire tension, everything either works together or it doesn't. And unlike the front yard, there was no easy way to just redo a piece back here. I started by installing the anchor points for the steel cables. These were eye screws drilled directly into solid wood on the tree trunks, placed carefully so the lines would run as clean and symmetrical as I could get them. Then came the turnbuckles, which let me fine-tune the tension instead of guessing and hoping it looked right. And once the steel cable was in place, I pulled it nice and tight, because sagging lines would immediately kill the whole look. Then it was time to put the bulbs up. One by one, I started hanging them, zip tying every single one to the steel cable so the wire itself wasn't carrying any hanging load. It was tedious and very repetitive, and as I got the bulbs hung up, that familiar worry came back. Is this gonna feel warm and comforting, or is it gonna feel cheap? And after everything else I'd put into the project, that was the last thing that I wanted. I stepped back a few times as I worked, squinting and changing angles, imagining what it would look like once the sun went down, trying to just picture people sitting out here, trying to picture Alexis coming home and coming out back and feeling like this space belonged to her too. There was a moment where I realized there was no longer a clean exit. The holes were drilled, the cable was tensioned, the bulbs were hung up, and the only way forward was through. So I finished the line, clipped the last zip tie, and stood there in the backyard, looking at something that still hadn't proven itself yet. But everything was ready. And for the first time in the whole project, there was nothing left to do but trust myself. Now, there's a strange kind of feeling that happens right before something ends. By the time everything was connected, the tools were away, and the last bulb was hung, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Nothing had changed yet, but everything was ready to. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, not because I was checking anything, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like right before. Because once the lights came on, this version of the house, the dark, unfinished one, would be gone. And then I plugged everything in. And when the lights came on, it wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden transformation, no shock of brightness. Instead, the house softened. The yard regained its shape. Shadows didn't disappear, they just became part of the design. The trees felt taller and the ground felt more defined, and the space finally made sense. It didn't really feel like I added something. It felt like I finally found a way to display how our house feels to us. And in that moment, I realized how much this project was never about lighting in the technical sense. It was about changing how it feels to arrive somewhere, about turning the end of a long day into something gentle. Now, while I've been working on this project, Alexis has been gone on a work trip the entire time, meaning she has no idea that I've done any of this work. So let's see what she thinks of the final product.
All right, she just texted me and should be home in about a minute or two here. So I'm outside, I've got all of the lights on, everything looks incredible, and we're gonna get her first reaction when she sees this coming back from the work trip. I really hope that she at least even notices that I did something here.
Oh, there she is. There's her work truck. Welcome home.
It looks so much brighter.
Okay, so you noticed that there's a difference.
I mean, yeah, I can actually, well, one, I can actually see this, but then, like, hold on, let me get out of the car.
So while you were gone, I did a little work.
Okay, I see that.
We have some more lights on the house.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I love this and that.
The trees?
Yes.
Well,
It
hold on.
looks so much better.
There's
Sorry.
more. There's
Okay.
more behind you, over here, as well.
Oh, I mean, it just looks in general, like it's definitely the lightest house on the block on the street.
We've got lights on the whole front, which actually you can see better if you come all the way over here. You can actually
This
see.
is a vibe. I can't.
We need to put something there.
Yeah, we're gonna put something there because it needs to have a good vibe.
And then all the trees over here are lit up.
That looks so good.
You like it?
Very luxy.
Yeah.
Type.
Yeah.
Vibe. I like it.
But also just like comfortable.
Yes.
It's warm. It's welcoming.
Very warm. Very welcoming.
There's one more piece of this.
Okay.
You gotta come this way though.
Okay. That looks so cute.
I had a lot of worries about doing this. I was like 50% this could end up looking like a trailer park, 50% like luxury restaurant patio. Which one is it?
I would say patio.
You feel like this is more patio?
Yes.
I avoided the trailer park?
You avoided the trailer park.
Hot damn.
I do think anything that you put in the middle will really tell you.
Well, I got sticks in there right now.
I see that.
Yeah. We're gonna have a bonfire
Okay.
right there
Okay.
tonight.
Okay.
Unfortunately, literally the day before she got home, our county put a burn ban in place, so we won't actually be having a bonfire, but we're going to use the space the best that we can. Alexis works in a profession that asks a lot from her, emotionally, physically, mentally, and there are days when that weight doesn't stay at work. It follows her home, and you can't fix that with a project or with tools or materials, but you can create a space that helps. A place that feels calm instead of chaotic, warm instead of cold, alive instead of empty. And watching the house glow for the first time, I thought about how many people quietly carry more than they let on. How many of us are exhausted in ways that don't show up on the outside, and how easy it is to underestimate the impact of small, intentional care. If you know somebody who's struggling, check in on them. Not dramatically, not publicly, just genuinely. And if you're struggling yourself, it doesn't mean you're broken, it means you're human. The world doesn't need grand gestures as much as it needs steady ones. And that's what this was. When I started this project, I told myself it was just lighting. Just something practical, something small that would make the house look nicer at night. But standing here now with everything finished, it's clear that it was never really about that. So much of life is lived in motion, leaving early, coming home late, moving from one responsibility to the next. And somewhere in the middle of all that, we forget that home is supposed to be a reset, a place that gives something back to you instead of asking for more. This house didn't necessarily feel broken before, it just felt unfinished in a way that was hard to describe. Like it wasn't fully aware of the people living inside of it yet. And now, after something as simple as adding some lights, it feels different. It feels more live. And what surprises me the most is how small the change actually was. There was no major renovation, no permits, no contractors, no big moment where everything suddenly became perfect. Just time, effort, and attention paid to details that most people will never consciously notice. But that's kind of the point. Care doesn't usually show up as something loud or impressive. It shows up quietly, in the choices that you make when no one is watching, in the effort that you put into things that don't benefit you directly, in the spaces that you create for the people that you love. Alexis will never think about the wiring paths or the voltage readings or the hours spent trying to get under a driveway that didn't want to cooperate. She'll never know how much thought went into where each light sits or why certain parts of the yard glow the way that they do, but what she will feel is something simpler than that. She'll feel welcome in her own home. And honestly, that's enough for me. If there's anything I've learned from this project, it's that you don't need to solve everything at once. You don't need to fix the whole world. Sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is make one small corner of it feel safer, warmer, and more human. Especially for the people who carry more than they let on. Sometimes, all it takes to change how a place feels is deciding that it's worth the effort.